I'm Peter McCully. On this edition of Today in BC, it's our Made in BC book club featuring two authors. We'll chat with Kate Gateley about The Tides of Sovereign, which recently won top prize at the Canadian Book Club Awards in the sci-fi fantasy genre.
We spend so much time looking for external validation or trying to find the way that we interact with the world. We forget to find who we are inside and have that guide us forward. So my writing journey was very much listening to that.
We're also chatting with Rob Wipond, the BC investigative journalist whose new book, Your Consent is Not Required, examines the involuntary mental health treatment system.
It's very underreported, and a lot of people don't talk about it because it can be a very humiliating and indeed, for many people, traumatizing experience to get labeled as severely mentally ill and locked up.
Our Made in BC book club, when Today in BC continues.
Why spend hours searching dealerships, comparing makes and models? Find the best of BC's inventory in one place, todaysdrive.com. You'll have access to inventory across BC, where you can easily find a vehicle that fits your needs and gets you where you need to go in comfort. Get in the driver's seat. Don't miss out on the many options we have available for you. Powered by Black Press Media, todaysdrive.com connects you with exclusive new and used car deals.
Kate Gateley, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background and what inspired you to become a writer?
I think I didn't have a standard writing path. I always liked telling stories. I've always been telling stories in my head. Common to my generation, we went and got a degree and tried to find a job and a house, and I found myself in a science degree and was not supposed to be doing a science degree, so switched to linguistics, loved linguistics, but by then life was carrying on and we were moving out from Saskatchewan to Vancouver Island, had kids, pandemic, and I found myself just really unsatisfied, and I've got a busy brain, and finally got back to the fact, what do I love? Telling stories.
Are there any particular authors or books that have inspired you along this path, inspired you in your writing, or that you might look to as influences?
Growing up, everyone my age, probably similar, we were all huge into Harry Potter. We would be waiting at the launches at midnight. Saskatoon has a great, massive independent bookstore called McNally Robinson, and we would be there in the rain and the sun. Now we sit, unfortunately, that author has some pretty negative viewpoints that she sits in, but the stories were really important to us. So consequently, I actually find myself writing with a lot of sort of English dialogue styles. And as an adult, I read more like Diana Gabaldon and Outlander, Deborah Harkness, Discovery of Witches, and those are definitely comp titles to what I like. I read what I like, but when I'm writing, I don't read in my genre at all.
I found a review of your book that said, and I quote, "In Tides of the Sovereign, Kate Gateley offers a sprawling journey that melds the everyday tribulations of a university student with the hidden world of magic, reincarnation, and mythology." And I really thought that was a great summation of the book. Without giving it all away, maybe you could tell us about the main characters, the plot, and I understand it's the first in a trilogy.
It is the first in a trilogy. So Julia, the main character, she's in her 30s, because I wanted to write adult fiction with an adult character. I'm also in my 30s, so write what you know. She's found herself in university. She's not super satisfied. Very similar to my own experience, not sure what to do with herself and feeling like she was on the wrong path or a path L for a different version. And so she's taking a course and this professor comes along, Donal O'Brien, and he's like strangely familiar and she can't figure out why. Long story short, not really a spoiler, they've shared past lives together, so they have been living through reincarnation and prophecy-based curses to defeat the big bad Cassius and So she goes from one life to the next, and she has to make some pretty big choices. She has to take the plunge. That's the first book. So if you're familiar with some of the feminist witchcraft development stuff, we start with the maiden, we move to the mother, and then to the crone. And so she's in her maiden stage where she has to self-initiate due to society, due to her childhood, due to all kinds of things, has to figure out how to step into her power. The second book, which published on February 21st, Mantle of the World Ruler, is her in the power, learning how to be an adult, how to be a witch in her power, how to be a woman standing in her strength. And I'm currently working on book 3. She's still in the same age category, but she's moving into her power in the last one, into the wisdom, into the confidence. So it's lots of, the trilogy mirrors sort of themes throughout as well.
How long has it taken you to write 3 books?
First book, 9 months. It was a lot like a baby. I just weaned my second baby and started writing my first book baby. And then the second one was about 10 months. And the third one, because I'm spending so much time with these other 2 books, is taking me a bit longer. But it's coming. It's coming.
It's funny you mentioned you write about what you know. And that's what I was always told. Write about what you know. And you did in both places you're familiar with in the book and the occupation of Julia's love interest.
Yeah. And I think all the little details in between, too, unbeknownst to people, I know a lot about a few things and not a lot about anything one specific. So I threw it all into the story. The places, so I write about Saskatchewan because I lived in Saskatchewan. I write about BC because I love it out here. A lot of the travel that happens in the book, a lot of the places I haven't visited, but I'm very well researched. And I had a friend say to me, people produce movies about astronauts. They don't have to be astronauts. You just have to be well researched. So there is that. And then the linguistics. Linguistics was important to me because I did my second degree, and it was the first time I was inching closer to what I wanted to be and what I wanted to do in a more authentic way. I figured I wanted to give it a special place in the book, too.
What's the writing process for you? The first book is 500 pages. That's a lot of research, notes, voice memos, emails to yourself, writing on the palm of your hand.
All of it. All of it. When I started writing, one of the gifts I gave to myself, or the promises I made, was that I had to come up with my own process. There's so many different ways to write, so much different advice. And for me, escaping that sort of perfectionism of my own history, I had to come up with my own process. So that was a little bit clumsy sometimes. I don't like voice memos. I can't stand hearing my voice read back to me very much. So we'll see how I feel about the podcast. I do have a notes in my app. I also learned through this process, I've been learning how my own brain works. And I actually have a pretty big capacity for just holding information about the story in my head. I can't remember to pick up milk, but I can remember important details about the story. I think I'm still learning my process, but yeah, lots of notes.
It seems to be working for you.
Hope so.
Your first book has won an award, the top prize at the Canadian Book Club Awards in the sci-fi fantasy genre. How do you feel about that?
Very excited. It's lovely because it's a reader-based vote. As an author, you love entering into competitions, and it's great to be adjudicated by other authors. That's super fruitful as a writer, and it gives you motivation, but it's really lovely having readers cheer for the story. Because for me, in my writing, I want to put the ideas out. I want them to meet people a certain way, and yeah, publishing is one thing, but the story is what motivates me and what is important, so having readers love that, that's the juice.
What theme or message do you hope readers will take away from the book Tides of the Sovereign after they read it?
Well, Julia's journey is so much about connecting back to her intuition. Again, lots of theories around this, but what I found in my own journey is we spend so much time looking for external validation or trying to find a way that we interact with the world. We forget to find who we are inside and have that guide us forward. So my writing journey was very much listening to that, finding that place, sitting with the quiet and expressing who you really are and finding your own journey. And that might not be what everyone else is, and that's good too.
I was going to ask you what the biggest challenge was that you faced in writing Tides of the Sovereign, and I think you alluded to it, that you had wee ones around. Might have been the biggest challenge.
That is the biggest challenge. I wish I could say writer's block was a thing for me. If I reach a point in my career when I'm having writer's block, I'll know I've really dived into being a writer. I'll have the time, but right now it's just finding the time. And I'm able to sit down and write thousands of words at a time. I can hyper-focus, but to carve that space while raising kids, while running several businesses, that is my biggest challenge.
So what can readers expect from future installments, and what are the titles?
Well, book 3 title is still a secret.
Okay.
You can expect that launch in the fall.
I won't tell anyone.
No. Book 1 is Tides of the Sovereign, and book 2 is Mantle of the World Ruler, and book 3 is book 3 of the Lost Wealth trilogy, title TBD.
I must say, your book was the first book I've run across that offered a video trailer as a sneak preview for readers. How did that all come about?
So book trailers are a thing. They're just starting to be on social media, but they're usually quite rudimentary, stock image, which is great. It's to give people a sense. I'm extremely visual. I write in my head. When I'm writing, I see the scenes. I'm describing a room in my mind. I'm describing actions in my mind. So the beauty of being able to cast it onto a visual trailer was really exciting for me and really motivating. And the cool kind of part of that is each of the trailers, as we've done them, I've been at the completion point of my initial manuscript. So I'm sometimes picking scenes that I want to see actually play out ahead of me and see if they'll play out the way I imagine them through marketing or for media, and also just for the cinematic element of fantasy.
It's very interesting because you write and you see what you write, and most folks read, they have a film going in their head that they're reading. To tease that with something visual, very interesting concept.
And really fun.
You mentioned the linguistics degree that you have. That'll come in handy when you're working on your audiobooks, right?
I did it a long time ago. I graduated in 2012. And so when I was looking for an audiobook narrator, there's a lot of accents in the book. So I have some familiarity with accents. More than anything, I can tell when they're not right. So I was looking for someone locally because Julia is Canadian. I wanted a Canadian accent, but there's so many dialects of other accents for the UK and in Ireland. I ended up actually sourcing my narrator in England and teaching her my accent instead so that she could handle the other ones with confidence and she could work directly with me. I had friends reading Harvard sentences and we were working back and forth, and I was able to bring in my phonetic knowledge with linguistics. You know, she did a good job.
I'll look forward to listening to that. Are there any other historical periods or events that you're particularly interested in that might find their way into your books in the future?
This one I focus on my Irish ancestry on one side. I do have family that came over to Canada during the Russian Revolution. That might be a curious area. But what I think I'm most interested in is actually one of the themes in this series is ancestral memory and past versions of ourselves. And I would love to take a chance to look at how our current versions of ourselves can play into future. So not so much sci-fi, because I'm not a tech-minded person that way, but it would be hard for me to create that world. But maybe speculative or dystopian, we take these versions of ourselves now and how do we apply that into our future and what does that look like?
Kate, Tides of the Sovereign is your first book.
My book, baby.
Yeah. What was the experience of publishing and promoting your first book like, and what do you think you've learned from all of that?
Because I'm doing a trilogy, the biggest sort of tip around trilogies is you have to keep pushing forward so they come out in a timely manner. So big lessons are balancing time, finding that time that doesn't exist. I have learned that the writing is my deep work. When I get into it, it feels good. It's motivating. I'm more challenged by emails and tedious tasks, so I try to brain hack my way into doing those in times of day when it's passive, and then I can carve the time to write. Yeah, it's a work in progress.
Have you thought ahead to what you will be writing about after the trilogy is done?
Oh, it's interesting. My characters, I feel like I've been carrying the characters from this first series in my body, in my mind, and the wings of my creativity for my whole life. And it's interesting, I've started to think about the next one, and I don't know what it is yet, but I can feel the new characters and the new story. It's starting to show up. So I don't know, but they're here. It's coming.
Tides of the Sovereign is your debut novel, your very first novel, and it's a hit, obviously. So what advice would you give to aspiring writers who are looking to get their works published?
The best advice I could give is find the way that allows you to do your deep work and the way for you to bring your story forward. And that doesn't look the same for everyone. And it's not going to be the way it used to be with agents and different things has changed. So find your yes, find what gets you putting the pages down, put the paper down, excited, motivated, and go from there, because the story is the part that keeps you moving through the hard times.
Kate Gateley, author of Tides of the Sovereign. When the Today in BC Made in BC book club continues, BC investigative journalist Rob Wipond, author of Your Consent is Not Required.
Hey, it's the Moj, Bob Marjanovic. Join me on the Moj on Sports podcast on Black Press Media at todayinbc.com. Listen into conversations with well-known athletes and celebrities as we look behind the scenes at these successful people. Listen in to the Moj on Sports podcast on todayinbc.com. You'll also find the Moj on Sports podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, iHeart, YouTube, and Google Podcasts, as well as mojonsports.com.
Today in BC is a Black Press Media podcast. I'm Peter McCully. Rob Wipond is a freelance journalist who writes frequently of the interfaces between psychiatry, civil rights, policing, surveillance, and privacy, as well as social change. His articles have been nominated for 17 magazine and journalism awards. Rob joins us to talk about his new book, Your Consent is Not Required. Thanks for joining us today, Rob.
Oh, you're welcome. Nice to be here.
Can you give us a brief overview of your book, Your Consent is Not Required, and what was the motivation behind writing it?
The subtitle is a very important extension, The Rise in Psychiatric Detentions, Forced Treatment, and Abusive Guardianships. I'm really focused on mental health laws in both Canada and the United States, and the broadening use of these laws onto a wider range of people than we normally imagine. I got very interested in it because it happened to my father. He reached out at a difficult period in his life for help at a local psychiatric hospital in Kelowna. and was fairly rapidly turned into an involuntary patient and treated against his will. And I was quite aghast that here a person with no mental health history of any kind, a career college professor of computer engineering, could suddenly be a certified mental patient, supposedly lacking insight and needing to be forcibly treated. I was just aghast, and I immediately started to wonder, who else is this happening to and what's their story?
Rob, you talk about the numbers of citizens being detained under non-criminal mental health laws in Canada, as you've just spoken about, and the U.S., and that they're at all-time highs.
Yeah, people are often surprised to hear that because we hear quite a different story in the news media. It's certainly true that large asylums from the 1950s and 60s have largely closed, but there's been a real growth of smaller facilities, psychiatric wards in general hospitals, group homes, assisted living. There's all sorts of places where people can be forcibly treated, or they're under constant monitoring and coercion at any time, can be sent up to the psychiatric hospital. And the numbers show fairly consistently across Canada and indeed across North America, wherever we can get good numbers. And I must emphasize, it's very difficult to get good numbers. Governments are not wanting this to really be publicly known, and they are not carefully tracking it. But Canada's centralized healthcare systems help a little bit in getting that data. And wherever we do, we see the numbers going up a lot, doubling and tripling over the last decade or two. And that also outpacing population growth quite significantly.
In the book, you explored the ways in which institutions and individuals can use various tactics at their disposal to force treatment on people without their full understanding or informed agreement.
Yeah, and one of the main purposes of the book is to show how widely this is happening. So, for example, the school system. We saw a report from the representative for children and youth in British Columbia that identified this trend as well, seeing that the rates of students being sent up to psychiatric hospitals and detained and forcibly drugged had been skyrocketing. And so that's one institution. And then long-term care facilities often use forced treatment using antipsychotic drugs to tranquilize patients, often with dementia. We see workplaces where people getting into conflict with each other in workplaces where traditionally there'd be some sort of conflict resolution process. Often now that becomes one side of the conflict, usually the person with less power, being coerced or pressured or even forced into some sort of psychiatric care. So we're seeing this across society right now. It's very underreported, and a lot of people don't talk about it because it can be a very humiliating and indeed for many people traumatizing experience to get labeled as severely mentally ill and locked up.
The book also discusses the power dynamics which are involved in consent, particularly in those relationships where one person holds more power than the other. Can you talk about why this is important to consider when discussing consent itself?
I was just highlighting the workplace example of that. So here's a case where even before you get to the invoking of mental health laws, there's a lot of power in the workplace context where one person can feel under threat if they could lose their job, fall into poverty, or lose their home. And so those threats are very real. And I show in the book, like, for example, one of the places this is happening, ironically, if you will, is in the medical system and any kind of the licensed professions where people can lose their licenses. And so there's this aggressive approach to helping people with their mental health. And so you may go in actually seeking help, consenting, and then suddenly find yourself in a situation where the tables are turning and they're saying, now that we've done our assessment, we think you're worse off than you think you are, and we want you to take a treatment that you didn't want. You wanted something else. Perhaps you wanted therapy. And suddenly you're in this battle for your own rights in that kind of situation. So that's another thing I explore in the book, is this wide-ranging way in which people's consent, their voluntary desire to get help, can actually be turned against them. And this has become so common that, in fact, some jurisdictions have passed laws that explicitly say, almost literally, if you disagree with what the psychiatrist is recommending your treatment should be, you can go from voluntary to involuntary patient. Like, that's one of the criteria they use.
Rob, one of the issues you explored in the book is the way that mental health law powers can be used as a shield by institutions to protect themselves from legal or ethical consequences. So how can we ensure that coercion is not used in this manner?
It's a very difficult, challenging situation. I was surprised myself at the extent of it to discover that it's, as one lawyer said to me, a bread and butter harassment tactic with whistleblowers within government, within military and veterans administration, in corporate environments, in all sorts of situations where whistleblowers are coming forth. These kinds of powers can be invoked. People can be forced into psychiatric evaluations. Sometimes they can get locked up. And this is really used to discredit these whistleblowers. This is much worse in the United States than in Canada, but not for a good reason. That's because Canada's whistleblower protections are so poor, they often don't have to go this far in order to discredit people. But in the United States, it's really quite common that mental health laws are used by institutions. However, in Canada, they're used in a more ad hoc way against complainers and protesters. So I look at a case, for example, of a fellow in British Columbia, Gordon Stewart, who was protesting against Revenue Canada. And he had a really well-documented history of being essentially unfairly harassed by them and was protesting outside their offices. And in the course of these kinds of engagements with them, they ended up calling 911, and he ultimately got locked up in a psychiatric hospital. So how do we stop that? It goes to how broad these laws are, and they've really gotten out of control, and we've given doctors extraordinary discretion here. And we really need to start looking at that. It's really hard to say because it touches so many aspects of what we're using these laws for. How do we stop that situation? What I want to do, first of all, is just highlight that it's happening because it's not getting coverage. And then publicly, we need to discuss how to stop it because there's a lot of different issues. It's complex. I don't want to say it's simple, but we need to publicly discuss it more.
How do you go about educating people on the risks of these powers, particularly when it comes to issues like sexual assault and harassment? How can we improve education about the risk of involuntary treatment in our communities and our institutions?
I highlight in the book how it's not uncommon at all that people who get into these situations where they're so disempowered, locked up in an institution of this kind, that they can be abused quite easily, much in the way that we saw in the residential school system when children were dragged into that and they had so little power that it actually drew people, it seemed, to that system who wanted to have that kind of power over children. So it's very dangerous, and we're seeing similar tendencies within the psychiatric system. One of the things I'm just trying to do is highlight for people how much this is happening and what a concern it is, how we need to regulate these. We need way stronger oversight and accountability. There's virtually none. You look at what happened in British Columbia, the ombudsperson did an investigation. They found that only 28% of psychiatric incarcerations were even legal. Basically, they routinely break the laws as they currently exist. So that's a problem. That's an accountability issue. Overall, I say let's start at least getting more data on who this is happening to, how often it's happening, what are the outcomes, are people getting better, are they getting worse, and more oversight and accountability for the entire system.
So in those situations where people's consent is being manipulated or ignored, do you have any key recommendations or strategies for folks in those situations? When
you talk about consent being manipulated, my mind goes to the question of children in particular. Here we have these education, mental health literacy programs for children, and when I looked at them, I found them rife with all sorts of misleading and medically false statements. They're essentially trying to convince children that if they have the slightest distress or disruption that lasts for a couple of weeks, they should go to a psychiatric hospital, seek help. And it's very coercive in that sense. They're really not honest with what we do and don't know. And basically, we don't know very much about what really causes inner emotional stress for people. We don't have a lot of medical evidence to support this kind of approach. A lot of these drugs are really just tranquilizing and sedating medications. So that's where I go there, that we really need to back up and recognize that we're doing this, that we're coercing children into a certain way of thinking. That's a much broader social-wide problem that to some degree I don't even really get into in the book. The notion of being informed. The law is informed consent is what you should have in a medical context. And we're so far from that in a mental health situation that it's hard to even begin. So I only focus on where your rights are explicitly taken away using the laws. I don't even get into when you've been misled with improper information, often by your own doctor, which is not uncommon at all, that doctors say, oh, you've got a biochemical imbalance, this drug will correct it. There's really no science to back that kind of statement up, but people still hear it all the time from their doctors.
So maybe that's book number 2, the follow-up.
Yes, actually, that's exactly what I've been thinking too. I really wanted to focus on this clearer issue. I think everybody can relate to the idea of, hey, I don't want to lose my rights to make decisions about my mental health care. Or maybe even if I really am in crisis for a short period and they do help me, I want to get my rights back quickly. Almost nobody says, oh, sure, take away my rights forever. I wanted to get at that because I think everybody can understand the desire to have your own empowerment and agency over your own life. But I do think as a culture, there is a broader discussion to be had about what does mental health even mean? It's coming to mean all things to all people. And is that a good thing? Is it always positive to say we're going to help your mental health? Because how are we really defining that? Different people have different ways of understanding who they want to be in their lives and how they want to live. And it's not always a doctor who should be the arbiter of what's right and what's wrong about how you want to think and feel in your own mind.
The book is Your Consent Is Not Required. Rob, what do you hope readers take away from the book?
I really hope that they understand this main message, that mental health laws have actually broadened a lot, and they've become very risky, dangerous tools, and indeed, to some degree, weaponized in a lot of contexts. And so let's be more honest about what's happening and demand more accountability from governments and from the institutions that are implementing them.
I'd like to thank Rob Wipond, author of Your Consent Is Not Required, and Kate Gately, author of Tides of the Sovereign, for being with us on this edition of Today in BC's Made in BC Book Club. If you have suggestions or comments, send a voice message to podcast@blackpress.ca. You may be part of our podcast mailbag segment. You'll find Today in BC podcasts on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, iHeart, and Google Podcasts.